Kiev's status as a world power gone? And can President Zelensky in Ukraine prevail? Also, where will and what will the position be as Boris Johnson prepares to leave office? We'll be analysing this in depth throughout the programme. It also marks 31 years since Ukraine broke free from the shackles of the Soviet Union. There were meant to be parades in Kiev today, but were abandoned due to fears of Russian strikes and retaliation for the death of a key Putin ally. And as the war drags on in Europe, indeed, what is the response of the rest of Europe? Is the EU starting to fracture? And will the energy crisis in the coming months result in a push for peace between Russia and Ukraine? As always, get in touch with your views, GBViews at gbnews.uk, or indeed tweet me at GBNews. All that and so much more in this special edition between now and 4. But first, at the top of the hour, the very latest news headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 2 minutes past 3. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has made a surprise visit to Ukraine's capital to mark the country's Independence Day. Speaking with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelenski, in Kiev, the Prime Minister said he believes Ukraine can and will win this war. Mr. Johnson's visit to the war-torn country comes as it also marks 6 months since the Russian invasion began. The two leaders held a joint briefing where he said now's not the time for what he calls a flimsy plan for negotiation with Russia.
I want to remind you, Volodymyr, that when you rang me at 4 o'clock in the morning on that grim day in February, and you told me the news that we had been dreading, that Putin had been so insane as to invade a sovereign European country, I told you then that we were shoulder to shoulder with you, and that is as true today as it was in that horrific moment.
Meanwhile, the United States has announced an aid package to Ukraine worth more than £2.5 billion. President Joe Biden says the funding will allow Ukraine to acquire weapons, air defence systems and radars to defend itself for years to come. The 35-year-old man suspected of being the target of a shooting in Liverpool which killed a 9-year-old girl has been named in the media as convicted burglar Joseph Nee. Merseyside police earlier confirmed he'll be questioned in connection with the murder of Olivia Pratt-Corbell. His arrest is for breaching the terms of his release from prison. Officers are urging anyone with information relating to the shooting to come forward. Auxiliary Bishop of Liverpool, Thomas Williams, explains the impact it's had on the community.
This would galvanise, I think, people, to get them. I think that we are totally united in this, in every single way, by the horror of it. The biggest problem, I think, is fear, and that's what people are highlighting now. If people are afraid, what they're afraid of. And the problem is we're very often afraid of the unknown. When things like this happen, it's too real.
Meanwhile, in London, police investigating the shooting of an 18-year-old man have offered a £20,000 reward for information about his murder. Newly released CCTV footage shows a car involved in the shooting of Alex Sayanaku, who died nearly a year ago. A new appeal for information comes amid a wave of violent crimes in the capital. More than 23,000 people have crossed the English Channel in small boats this year, more than double the number at the same time last year. GB News has learned another 500 migrants made the crossing today, with more boats coming in this afternoon. It follows a record day on Monday, which saw nearly 1,300 make the journey in 27 small boats. That's the highest daily total since current records began 4 years ago. Ofgem has been challenged by Scotland's Children's Commissioner over the decision to raise the energy price cap. Bruce Adamson has written to the industry regulator about the potential impact of a cap increase. He's warning more families will be pushed into poverty this winter. Ofgem will make its latest announcement on Friday, with experts forecasting average annual bills will increase to more than £3,500. Mountain biker Rab Wardell has died just 2 days after winning the Scottish cross-country championship. The 37-year-old suffered a cardiac arrest and died in his sleep yesterday. Mr. Wardell won the elite men's title on Sunday. His partner, Olympic gold medalist Katie Archibald, has revealed she tried to resuscitate him and has posted an emotional statement online confirming his death. Bin strikes seen in Edinburgh in recent days are expected to grow elsewhere as refuse collectors at 13 Scottish local authorities plan to walk out. Bin workers from cities including Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen will join their colleagues in Edinburgh in taking industrial action. Trade unions were offered a 5% pay rise, but a deal wasn't reached. Rubbish has been piling up in the Scottish capital since the strike started last Thursday, and they aren't expected to end for another week. And Princess Diana's much-loved Ford Escort is due to be auctioned this weekend at Silverstone. The car, driven by Princess Diana in the late 1980s, is thought to be one of a kind, the only RS Turbo Series 1 in black. It's expected to fetch more than £100,000. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now that it's back to Darren with the briefing.
Thank you very much indeed, Rhiannon. It is 7 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Wednesday afternoon. We're on TV, online, and of course on your wireless radio too, Virgin 604. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and for your company this afternoon. We're going to start the programme as we mean to go on, and that is with that breaking news, as you can see in the last couple of minutes. Boris Johnson is in Kiev this afternoon, probably on what will be his last official visit as Prime Minister, to meet President Zelenski. He received an award while in the Ukrainian capital. It was a surprise visit, must be said, but it comes on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It is 6 months to the day since that invasion began, but it is also on the day of Ukrainian independence, 31 years since they left the Soviet Union. Let's bring in the Minister for the Armed Forces, that is James Heappey, who joins me down the line now. James, very good afternoon to you. Just first of all, a reflection on the Prime Minister's visit. I think it is fair to say, whether you like the Prime Minister or not, that he has been a steadfast friend of President Zelensky over the last year or so, and that was reflected today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and people shouldn't dismiss how much personal courage it takes to go to Kiev, especially on a red letter day, as today is. It's their national day. When there was really good intelligence, which the US shared in recent days with the media, that said that Putin was intending to launch strikes on Kiev today. And yet Boris has gone anyway. And that, I think, just shows how personal it has become for him, that the government he leads and the United Kingdom beyond has stood tall in the world in supporting Ukraine. We've led in many ways. And I think it's fitting that Boris's last overseas trip looks like it will be to stand next to Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev.
And James, we know this is not simply about symbolism, is it? And we'll come on to some of the practical stuff in a minute, but symbolism does also matter. How important do you think it is that, in many ways, President Zelensky has stood next to Boris Johnson? Just those images on a day like this.
So it's hugely important. And what's really interesting is, when you travel around Europe, and I was in Estonia yesterday, there's an awful lot of countries that are looking very carefully at the leadership competition within the Conservative Party to become our next Prime Minister, because many around Europe, many around the world, see a very different Boris Johnson to the one that has been characterised over the last 9 months or so with everything that's gone on here. They regard him as having done a great job in driving international consensus, rallying support for Ukraine, and they're very sad to see him go. And actually, in the case of many countries, very nervous to know that whoever replaces him will be similarly committed and strong on Euro-Atlantic security.
If we can, to a degree, the Prime Minister seemed to be alluding in that press conference that we just played out here on GB News, that there already has unsurprisingly, been an awful lot of military aid to Ukraine, but that continues, including, it must be said, the training of Ukrainian troops here in Britain before they go out to the front line.
Yeah, it must continue. And let's be clear, it's expensive. We've spent £2.3 billion already, and I could easily spend another £1 billion tomorrow if I was given it to do so. But the cost of not doing it is even greater still, because, Putin doesn't just settle. It's not, no one should believe that if he could just be left with the Donbass, everything would be fine. Because that would be to hand him Ukrainian sovereign territory as a reward for the belligerence and aggression he's shown over the last 6 months. But because, as we saw with South Ossetia in Georgia and Abkhazia and the Crimea in 2014, what he hopes for is that he can show these outrageous moments of aggression, take the sovereign territory of another country, and then hope that the international opprobrium all fades away because it's too expensive and too difficult to keep it going. And so then he goes again and he takes another bite and another bite and another bite. If we, Darren, want to live in a Europe and a Euro-Atlantic region that is safe and secure and prosperous and affordable for the next 20 or 30 years, we have to accept the short-term pain of doing the right thing right now. And if I may, and I'm sorry this is a long answer, but the other thing that we have to have our eyes wide open to is that President Xi is watching very carefully how the international community responds to President Putin. And if we show a lack of resolve, he will cross the Taiwan Strait in the blink of an eye, and that will make all of this as a moment of global difficulty look like a walk in the park.
In saying that, it is difficult, isn't it, though, James? A lot of people are going to be struggling this winter, in part because of this war. Energy prices are going up. They hear you talk about £2.3 billion in military aid to Ukraine. They think that could be money that might be better spent at home. What would you say to our viewers and indeed to others who, in the end say if it comes down to a choice, would much prefer that actually this winter was a lot easier than continued support for Ukraine?
Well, I mean, Darren, I think that GBNews viewers are a patriotic bunch, and I think that their moral compasses are set in a way that means that instinctively all of your viewers will understand that doing the right thing, even if that is very costly to the UK as a country and to us individually as people, is the right thing to do in the name of standing up for what we believe in, and also to make sure that for the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're living in a world that isn't defined by war and instability, because that will be vastly more expensive.
I can. First of all, as you said, you were in Estonia yesterday. I think there's 1,600 British personnel there. Just talk us through what the purpose is of having British troops in Estonia and indeed in the Baltic region. Of course, they're not directly involved in any conflict. Just explain what the idea is, that why we have quite a few, it must be said, of our troops based in that part of the world.
Well, deterrence is the short answer. NATO has had for a while now this network of enhanced forward presence battle groups, and the UK has been the lead partner or the lead ally in the battle group in Estonia for a number of years. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, clearly many NATO allies on NATO's eastern flank were feeling particularly vulnerable. And so a lot of troops and aircraft and ships were moved forwards to the east to reassure them and to deter against a contagion from Ukraine into NATO territory. That's been very, very effective. It's produced huge amounts of reassurance, and the Estonians, just like the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Romanians, the Czechs, the Slovakians, are all hugely grateful for the commitment that the UK and other NATO allies have shown. That was very important in shaping the Madrid NATO summit, where NATO has revisited its war plans and now sees that we need to defend every last inch of NATO territory. And that means that in the future, whilst we won't maintain the commitment in Estonia or elsewhere exactly as it is right now. We need to regenerate our war-fighting army for whatever NATO might ask of us next. It does show that NATO as an alliance is now ready not to counterattack against Russian belligerents in the Euro-Atlantic, but to stand and fight for every last inch of NATO territory. And to countries in the Baltic, nothing means more.
And just finally, while I've got you, I should ask about this story. I think it was in the Times newspaper about the Red Arrows. They're being investigated, aren't they? Or some of them, I should say, over allegations of unacceptable behaviour with some recruits. I think 40 personnel saying that the situation is toxic. Reports of misogyny, bullying, sexual harassment. What's the MOD doing about this?
Well, a lot. It's under investigation and it will be investigated thoroughly. And if there's wrongdoing, if people have fallen short of the standards that we set, it doesn't matter whether they are the best trained fighter pilots in the Royal Air Force. They will be held to account. And Darren, this is being visibly expressed around the world, where the Royal Air Force, instead of flying in their world-famous 9-plane formation, they're currently flying as 7 planes because the Chief of the Air Staff have said that nobody is above the rules and the values and the standards of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. It's taken very seriously. But if I may, because the Royal Air Force has had a series of very negative stories running about it, which may or may not be justified. We're looking into everything that's been said. But the Royal Air Force is still an extraordinary warfighting organisation who over the last few years have been really carrying the biggest load in terms of prosecuting our nation's enemies and those that mean us harm, particularly through their work over Iraq and Syria in the Middle East. And in the last 6 months, since the Ukraine crisis began, they have flown 6,000 hours of combat operations, moving kit across Europe to support the Ukrainians, protecting NATO airspace, watching what the Russians are up to with their spy planes. It is the most extraordinary organisation doing the most extraordinary work. And I appreciate that it needs to be held to account for the complaints and the allegations that are in the media right now. But all of your viewers and the world beyond should know that the Royal Air Force is still one of the best air forces in the world.
OK, James, really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. That's James Heappey there joining us from the Ministry of Defence, the Minister for the Armed Forces. Thank you, James.
Thanks,
we'll be talking about this, weren't we? During that interview, I think we can show you some pictures now of Prime Minister Boris Johnson receiving that medal, the Ukrainian Order of Liberty from President Zelensky. Let's have a little look.
For outstanding personal contribution into strengthening Ukrainian-British interstate cooperation, supporting state sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, the Order of Liberty is awarded to Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
There you go, the Prime Minister receiving that award. Very grateful, Boris Johnson. In many ways, he seemed slightly taken back by it all. This, of course, as the Prime Minister visited Ukraine today. I think maybe his third visit to Kiev since this conflict began. Of course, this an important day for the country. It's effective Independence Day since it left the Soviet Union 31 years ago, but also 6 months on since that invasion. Let's bring in our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who is in the studio with us. Tom, as I was saying to James at the top there of that interview, there is no doubt, even for the Prime Minister's harshest critics, that he has in many ways been side by side with President Zelensky more than any other Western leader throughout this conflict.
Yes, and there is certainly a great deal of affection for Boris Johnson amongst the Ukrainian people. You only need to look at the roads that have been renamed after him, or indeed the National Rail Service of Ukraine that on the day of Boris's defenestration in Britain changed their logo on social media to add an animated mop of blonde hair atop it. Boris carries something of a cult status within Ukraine, and it's quite hard for a lot of people in the UK to really understand just how popular he is over there. But moments like this really show that it isn't confected, it is real. There is a genuine friendship between Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky, and frankly it will be a tough act to follow for the next Conservative Prime Minister, whoever they are, to carry the same force of personality. A lot of Boris Johnson's flaws in terms of his bombasticness, in terms of his sheer force of personality, in terms of his image, a lot of the things that were seen to be flaws of Boris Johnson when it comes to dealing with day-to-day governance or managing the operation in Number 10 were great assets when it came to be symbols abroad.
Just as you speak, Tom, we're just seeing some pictures. This is not live because we don't know the Prime Minister's current position, clearly for security reasons. So we're getting these played back with a delay from Kiev. But clearly the Prime Minister wasn't just in meetings today with President Zelensky, but like he's done before, he's gone out and about onto the streets. We're not entirely sure who he and President Zelensky are addressing as they talk into those microphones there. But it's clearly outside. James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, seemed to be alluding to earlier on, these visits clearly, he's the Prime Minister, he's got security, of course he has, but they are not without risks, given the concern today that Russia may well attack Kiev on the anniversary of its independence. There was meant to be a parade in the city today that got cancelled because of security concerns, but the Prime Minister has gone ahead. As I say, we're not entirely sure who they're talking to, but again a sign that the Prime Minister wants to stand shoulder to shoulder, literally, with the Ukrainian president and be seen as a very visible force on the streets of Ukraine. Tom, in saying that, what I noted also about the Prime Minister's press conference or speech a little bit earlier on is that he did emphasise that it wasn't just him who had President Zelensky's back, that it was the entire House of Commons. And that is an understandable but an interesting point the Prime Minister wanted to make, in the sense that this is probably going to be his last visit as Prime Minister abroad.
Yes, he wanted to assuage the nervousness of the Ukrainian people, that potentially what comes next will be less effusive in its support for that country and its struggle against Russian aggression and oppression. Clearly, Boris Johnson wanting to assuage those concerns. But really remarkable pictures of Boris Johnson walking around on the streets there in Kiev. As you rightly say, people being told to stay away from the parades. The American embassy this week saying that Americans should vacate the city. Boris Johnson going there and walking around with only a few guards around him, when we know the risk of missile strikes, when we know the risk of the sort of assassination attempts that the Russian state has carried out. It is a very brave move, and indeed the third of this conflict. But I thought also interesting in Boris Johnson's statement earlier were the words not just for the Ukrainian people, but for the people of Britain as well, where he was describing the energy crisis in the United Kingdom as almost a price worth paying. He said that we pay in our energy bills while the Ukrainian people pay in their blood, contextualising the issue that we're going into this winter.
I was just going to ask you about that, Tom, because clearly, anyone who lives... Oh, I think we're just going to listen in now, because it sounds like the Prime Minister's just about to speak, or President Zelensky is at least speaking in English. Let's have a listen in to what the Ukrainian President has to say.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this latest incredible honour that you've done me after you gave me that beautiful medal insignia just now, and that comes on top of my election as an honorary Cossack, and the card that which gives me, I think, free travel. I don't know whether it gives me free travel. They said it gave me free travel on Ukrainian. It's a kind of freedom pass for Ukrainian railways. So, but I want to stress that in receiving these, this is very much something I accept on behalf of the people of the whole of the United Kingdom, because it's really been a cause that has captured the imagination of all of our country. And I see the Ukrainian flag flying here. You will see it also in the streets of London, in villages, in towns across the whole of the UK, on churches, in shop windows. You will see the support that the British people have for the people of Ukraine. And my essential message for you today is that that support for your struggle to keep your independence is indivisible and will remain whatever happens in UK politics. And of that, I am absolutely certain. Thank you very much for the welcome you've given me, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Дякую, Борис.
Thank you.
Сам фото.
So there you go, that's the Prime Minister speaking in Ukraine. As I say, these pictures are not live, we should emphasise, because of security reasons. Unsurprisingly, he seems to be looking at a plaque on the ground there. He may well have been talking to Ukrainian troops in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev there, emphasising that medal he's received a little bit earlier on behalf or from the Ukrainian president was on behalf of all of the British public. You said you were united behind the efforts and the support in Ukraine during this war, and talked about, which is factually correct, all the flags that you see, not just here in London, but indeed in towns and villages up and down the country. The British public have been steadfast, it must be said, in the support of Ukraine during this war. The Prime Minister there, as I say, on the streets of Kiev. This possibly might be, probably will be, let's be frank about this, his last foreign visit as Prime Minister. In less than 2 weeks' time, there will be a new UK Prime Minister, as either Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss take over. We're expecting that to happen on September 6th. He seemed to be talking to Ukrainian troops there in Kiev. Let's bring back in Tom Harwood, who's sat next to me in the studio. Tom, really interestingly, that is the question I wanted to ask you. The Prime Minister talked about it there, didn't he? The flags, the support in Britain. But let's be honest about this. You know, the real pain of this conflict, and it's not comparable to clearly what the people of Ukraine are going through, but the real economic pain hasn't quite hit Britain yet. It will. Is there an expectation, a worry, a concern that actually that support may well start to fracture when things really get quite difficult here with the energy crisis we're expecting to really hammer home this winter?
Yes, I think that's one of the reasons why Boris Johnson is saying what he is saying today, really explicitly linking these two problems. The war in Ukraine causing this global energy price hike, causing thousands of extra pounds to be added to the bills of people in the United Kingdom, saying that this is part of this effort. Linking that in the minds of the British public is important in the view of Number 10, clearly, but also making the intellectual case that if Ukraine was to give up, if Britain was to say, we're not going to support you anymore, sign a peace agreement, give up Crimea, give up
the Donbass
Donetsk and Luhansk and the rest of it, give Putin that, and hopefully this will all stop. Well, history teaches us that if that's the case, it'll only be a couple of years before Putin's back with a bigger invasion yet. That's what happened in Crimea in 2014. It's what happened in Georgia in 2008. And every time that the West appeased Putin and said, OK, you take that, but go no further, a couple of years later, he went back and he went bigger, and it cost us more pain and more treasure later on.
Yeah, interesting. James Heapy was even making the point that President Xi in China may well also be thinking the same. Tom Harwood, for the time being, thank you very much indeed. As always, do get in touch, by the way, gbviews at gbnews.uk, or indeed tweet me at gbnews. We're going to have much more on this developing and breaking news story over the next 30 minutes, taking us up to 4 o'clock here on the Briefing PM. But first, at a little before the bottom of the hour, let's bring you up to date with the afternoon's top stories. Head over back to Rhiannon for the latest news headlines.
It's coming up to 3:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has made a surprise visit to Ukraine's capital to mark the country's Independence Day. Speaking with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelenski, in Kiev, the Prime Minister said he believes Ukraine can and will win this war. On his last visit to the war-torn country before leaving office, Mr Johnson set out a further £54 million package of military aid and vowed the UK will continue to stand with Ukraine.
I want to remind you, Volodymyr, that when you rang me at 4 o'clock in the morning on that grim day in February, and you told me the news that we had been dreading, that Putin had been so insane as to invade a sovereign European country, I told you then that we were shoulder to shoulder with you, and that is as true today as it was in that horrific moment.
Meanwhile, the United States has announced an aid package to Ukraine worth more than £2.5 billion. In a statement, US President Joe Biden said the funding would allow Ukraine to acquire weapons, air defence systems and radars to defend itself for years to come. The man suspected of being the target of a shooting in Liverpool which killed a 9-year-old girl has been named by newspapers as convicted burglar Joseph Nee. Merseyside police earlier confirmed the 35-year-old will be questioned in connection with the murder of Olivia Pratt-Corbell. His arrest is for breaching the terms of his release from prison. Officers are urging anyone with information relating to the shooting to come forward. More than 23,000 people have crossed the English Channel in small boats this year, more than double the number at the same time last year. GBNews has learned another 500 migrants made the crossing today, with more boats coming in this afternoon. It follows a record day on Monday, which saw nearly 1,300 making the journey in 27 small boats. That's the highest daily total since current records began 4 years ago. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound is 1.176 to the dollar and 1.186 to the euro. The price of gold currently stands at £1,483.30 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very welcome back to GB News and the briefing on this Wednesday afternoon. It is coming up to 25 minutes to 4 o'clock. We're on TV, in fact on Virgin 604 these days, on digital, the World Wide Web, and of course on the radio as well. Thank you very much indeed for your company. We are continuing with the developing story this afternoon. That is Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev to meet President Zelenski on what will probably be his last foreign affairs trip as Prime Minister. He's received a medal from the Ukrainian president. It comes, of course, 6 days to the day since that Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also 31 years to the day since Ukraine managed to break away from the Soviet Union. Well, we also heard earlier from Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who said that Ukraine will fight until the end. He said that in an emotional speech a bit earlier on in Independence Square. He said that the country would not be making any concessions or compromise to Moscow. Well, delighted to say we can speak to the Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Kira Ruddock, who joins me now from Kiev. Kira, very good afternoon to see you. Last time I was speaking to you, you were sat next to me here in the studio. You're now back in Ukraine. Just first of all, give us a sense of how important this day is for Ukraine, Ukraine's Independence Day.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Well, I can honestly tell you we did not think we will get to that. And it's a very happy day for us because we are still here, we are around, we are alive, and we are ready to fight as never before. Today, when people congratulate each other, they say, oh, we got to this, so good. Thank you that we are all alive. So, and today it's 6 months of war. Remember, on the first months, nobody actually believed that we will stand for more than a couple of days, maybe a week. And this is why it's so important to show that we are here, we are standing. On the first week, Putin promised that he will have a military parade on our central street. And today we are exhibiting destroyed Russian weapons and war machines there. And kids can play with them, and people are taking pictures of it. And we are showing that, no, we actually defended ourselves, and we are able to push back and move forward with. Of course, it's incredibly important. And this is the first year that we are celebrating Independence Day as a nation that is truly united and truly behind one cause, where we know what we are fighting for, and we know what's at stake, and we know the way that we want to win. This is incredibly important, and this is the feeling that we had never before.
How united still is the country, Kira? And I ask that question because clearly 6 months in, war is incredibly difficult, incredibly tough. Lots of people, millions of people have had to flee their homes. Tens of thousands of people have unfortunately left their lives. Trying to maintain morale must be quite difficult. It is. But you know what we learned during this war is that you can only win when you have allies, and you cannot be fighting alone. You need friends, you need allies behind your back and on your side. And this is why Ukrainian people are acting united and feeling united. Even Ukrainian politicians are doing their best. We are doing our best to come as a united front. You can imagine how hard it is to do it for 6 months, put all the political debates aside, and just act as Team Ukraine. But this is incredibly important for our country. And you have seen recently how well Ukrainian army was performing at the front, and you have seen the victories that we've seen. And it's not because we started fighting differently. It's because we started receiving more and more weapons that we were promised a while ago. And this is why we are saying we will be doing our part. We will be fighting, but we need our allies to continue doing their part. And this is the key strategy to win the war. And I would like to extend all the gratefulness of Ukrainian people to the United Kingdom and your nation. Thank you so much for being our strongest allies, for supporting us at this time and all times. Thank you. Our victories are mutual. No, well, thank you very much for that, Kira. I was just going to ask you, actually, Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, has been in Kiev today meeting President Zelenski. Is there a concern there? I'm sure you know, I'm sure others do, that Boris Johnson obviously is leaving office in a couple of weeks' time. Is there a concern that maybe with him no longer our Prime Minister, the Britain's support may wane a little bit?
We have spoken to both candidates to become a new Prime Minister, who both assured us that there would be no decrease in the support that Ukraine is getting from the United Kingdom. However, we also know, and we do understand, that we all are facing energy crisis, economic crisis, and it will be incredibly hard to maintain the good situation inside the country to be able to continue helping Ukraine. This is why I've been pushing on unfreezing Russian assets and using them for Ukraine's help or for covering to the expenses that you guys are having. But yes, there is this concern, and I hope that in the nearest future we will not only hear, but we'll see by the actions of the new Prime Minister that these concerns are for nothing.
Appreciate your time this afternoon. Take care, stay safe. Thank you very much indeed. Kira Ruddock there, a Ukrainian MP, joined us down the line from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Well, let's now talk about the impact on the ground, how the war, frankly, is going from both sides during this conflict. We're 6 months in. We're about to end the summer, aren't we? Head into the difficult autumn and winter, where it will rain a lot and it will get very cold in many parts of Ukraine. Who is the upper hand? Who is making progress and where? Let's speak to the former British Army Colonel and chemical weapons expert, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, very good afternoon to you. We've been reflecting throughout this programme, we heard it there from Kira, that of course Russia had expected, potentially by this stage, to be entirely in control of Ukraine. They are far from that. It's not been a war that Russia had expected.
Darren, absolutely, and I'm delighted that you've had a Ukrainian MP so articulately saying what the situation is and how good it is to see Boris Johnson into Kiev today. And I reiterate her wishes that whoever takes over from him is as resolute and supportive as Ukraine as he has been, as the UK's been. Because, again, as Kira says, we're all suffering from the cost of living crisis. As soon as we get peace in Ukraine and sorted out, that is the best way to get inflation and everything else under control. But on the ground, as you say, the Russians thought they would roll over Ukraine in a couple of weeks. 6 months down the line, we're in a very, very different position, a very dangerous position. We've seen the sort of 20th century tactics and equipment of the Russians now being devastated by the 21st century equipment and technology that the West, the US in particular, and ourselves have been able to give the Ukrainians. And I wouldn't underestimate all the training and intelligence we've given them. I'm on the edge of Salisbury Plain. There's several thousand Ukrainians, just down the road being trained at the moment. And it is very clear that the well-trained Ukrainian forces are more than a match for the highly trained original Russian forces. And now, of course, they're getting conscripts with a couple of days training and put into the front line. So we're in a position where Ukraine has held the Russians, pushing them back in some areas, and in some areas potentially retaking land. The counter-stroke, the counter-attack, whatever you like to call it, heading down to the south, could well take back Crimea. But this also puts us in a very challenging position, and we need to not waver at 1 inch our support to Ukraine. Whatever provocation, whatever threats, nuclear threats and others we get from the Russians, we need to hold our nerve, make sure the Ukraine military and people prevail. They've been so brave over these last 6 months, and get Putin to the negotiation table, get them out of Ukraine so that we can all get our lives back, on the level, and for the UK in particular, get our inflation back down, get the cost of living crisis sorted. It is so important. It is the only thing that our politicians should be concentrating on at the moment. So I'm delighted that Boris Johnson has made the effort to go to Ukraine today.
You also, though, didn't you, Hamish, talk about how this is a dangerous moment? And I know you and I and others have talked about this in the past, that there was always a concern that when backed into a corner, that Russia might up the ante. Is that still a concern, particularly maybe as we move into more challenging times, i.e. the autumn and the winter?
Well, escalation is what we're talking about here. Absolutely, it's a concern. And the Russians and Putin in particular, their brinkmanship is brilliant. They've been threatening us with nuclear weapons, from day one. But, I sort of think the most of that is to keep NATO, to keep us directly out of the fight. And if NATO was directly in the fight, Russia would be defeated fairly quickly. We see them doing some remarkable things like the the weaponization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which again, would have a tremendous effect. And I think the Russians are again using this as part of brinkmanship to try and hold the Ukrainian forces where they are, and to try and persuade the West to stop pouring in, finance and ammunition and training and new equipment, because the new equipment that we've given them is definitely turning the tide. The Russian equipment is just not what we all thought it was, and certainly their forces aren't. So we are in a dangerous position, but strength is the key here. I think if Putin sees any weakness in the Western alliance, that is when he will strike. And we must hold our nerve, because nobody, absolutely nobody in the world will gain from any nuclear confrontation. And the Russians know that. And Putin knows that he would be finished. I mean, he's going to be finished also if he's defeated in Ukraine. And I know a lot of people are saying, how can we find a way out for him? But, quite frankly, Russia without Putin is a country that I think all of us would like to see and be able to deal with in future.
OK, Hamish, as always, really appreciate your time and your analysis this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Hamish Gordon there. Well, what about the view from the rest of Europe? Being reported in some of the papers that there are concerns during that cost of living crisis that is affecting pretty much every corner of Europe, that support within the European Union might start to ebb away. Let's bring in Jack Parrock, who joins us from Brussels this afternoon. Jack, very good afternoon to you. Just talk us through this. It's been in the British press, this idea that somehow the EU might be, their support might be waning, though we've heard from Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz and others in recent days, not showing any sign of that.
No, I mean, they're trying to look united, just as we were hearing there. The priority, especially for European countries as part of that Western alliance, is to try and show unity, to try and show that there are no cracks. But just as in the UK, well, the economic forecasts in the UK are a little bit worse than in the European Union, the cost of living crisis is affecting everyone. Here in Belgium, where I'm sat, for instance, we saw the highest, a record-breaking amount for electricity on the wholesale market at over 561 euros per megawatt hour just the other day. So that is causing huge effects on the pockets of citizens, on consumers. And so there is also arguably some fatigue. The war's been going on 6 months now. People are hearing a lot about it. I suppose the ins and outs of every twist and turn in the conflict that we saw right at the beginning, when there was, when everyone was so shocked essentially that it had happened, that Russia had invaded Ukraine, that perhaps isn't being reported day in, day out. Now, we have heard today from the European Foreign Policy Chief, Joseph Borrell. He wrote a blog to mark this 6-month anniversary and also to mark the Ukrainian Independence Day, saying that Europe has to be prepared to pay the price for its values. And this really, it all does come down to this issue of gas and energy prices. There's been 7 rounds of sanctions now against Russia, including a number of individuals, the asset ban, freezes and travel bans, and all the way up to broad sweeping economic sanctions against Russia. But one of the big questions is, have those sanctions worked? And arguably, with the war raging on, perhaps they haven't.
Indeed, and that is a big question that it must be said, I've read a lot of this and I'm not entirely sure. Some people argue the sanctions are having an effect, others very limited. But there is concern, isn't there, in Berlin, in Paris, maybe even in Rome, where there's going to be an election in a couple of weeks' time, a concern that some of this could spill into civil disorder, Jack, given how difficult it's going to be, how much of a crisis it is. And every country is trying to mitigate it to varying and different degrees.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to the energy issue, which really is at the moment the fundamental one, Darren, to be honest. We heard in Germany there's discussions about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was sort of ended and suspended as part of the response to Ukraine, to the invasion of Ukraine, to prevent Russian gas from entering the EU that way. That actually that might be restarted, because the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, through which Russian gas has been continuing to flow, the Russians are sort of tinkering with it, saying that there's issues and that they need to be doing maintenance, etc., and that has caused real disruptions to the gas flows into Germany, which is heavily reliant on Russian gas. And the question is now, what does each individual EU country do? Because lots have different positions. The Hungarians, for instance, who are pro-Russia, went over to Moscow to sign extra deals for extra Russian gas. Other countries that have taken a harder line on Russia are trying to find other ways to bring liquid natural gas from North Africa and even from the United States, even though it's much, much more expensive. And so what this is going to do is firstly skew the prices upwards, obviously, but also it creates a bit of a political patchwork among EU countries about what they're doing at the moment. And the reality is, as we say, this all hits the pockets of the consumers. And as we've seen, I think it's fair to say that across Europe, just as it is in the United Kingdom, there's been overwhelming public support for Ukraine's fight against the Russian invasion. Question is, how long does that last?
Indeed.
If it gets linked to the fact that they're seeing skyrocketing prices to keep their households afloat?
Jack, as always, appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed. Jack Parrock there joining us live from Brussels this afternoon. Thank you, Jack. Well, on that issue that we've just been talking about, our Home Affairs and Security Editor Mark White has been looking at whether the support will remain steadfast given those pressures, and this is his report.
6 months on from the Russian invasion, in the towns of eastern Ukraine, this has become a war of attrition. Here in Toretsk, Arkady Batchuk is back to sift through what remains of his apartment block after the latest Russian shelling, which killed 2 of his neighbours. To add to the misery here, the strikes have crippled the town's water supplies, but Arkady and many others here are determined to stay put.
We are not planning to leave. I was born here, even though my wife is from Lviv. We got married and are living here. We are not planning to run anywhere.
Since the first missiles rained down on Ukraine's towns and cities, the West has been united in both its condemnation of Moscow and its support for the Ukrainian people. In the early days of the war, the Russian tanks rolled quickly over many miles of Ukrainian soil, encircling key population centres, including Ukraine's second city, Kiev, which suffered weeks of bombardment. But a rush towards the capital was halted and then reversed, thanks to fierce Ukrainian resistance. And growing numbers of sophisticated Western weapons systems provided by key allies, including the US and the UK. That Western resolve is holding, but with a bleak winter ahead, with many countries feeling the effects of energy shortages and the likelihood of economic recession, maintaining that high level of support over the long run could be a tough ask.
I think we're going to see a reduction in unity as we get into the winter, particularly with the energy problems that countries like Germany will face, both domestically and in industrial terms. And that, I think, will lead to Germany and other Western countries, including NATO countries, reducing their support for Ukraine and probably pressuring Zelensky to come to terms with Russia.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
One of the first Western leaders to travel to the Ukrainian capital after the outbreak of the war, Boris Johnson has been at the forefront of support for President Zelensky's efforts to fight off Russian aggression. Publicly, at least, both candidates to take over from Boris Johnson say that support will continue.
What we've seen, in the past few months is the Russians have made some gains. They've taken some territory in the Donbas region, but they're very incremental. The Ukrainians are pushing back. We're back to it's World War I like trench warfare. It's a war of attrition, and so unless something dramatic happens to change this war can grind on for a long time.
In recent weeks, Ukrainian troops have begun a pushback in some key areas, including around the strategically important city of Kherson, currently under Russian control, but looking increasingly isolated. 6 months on, Ukraine's armed forces and its people are in this fight for the long haul. They desperately hope their Western allies are as committed in the months ahead. Mark White, GB News.
OK, that is it from this special edition of The Briefing this afternoon, focusing, of course, on that war in Ukraine. The Prime Minister's visit. There'll be continuing coverage throughout the afternoon here on GB News. That's it from me for today, though. Patrick Christie is up next, filling in for Colin Brazier between 4 and 6. Tom Harwood is here for me tomorrow. I'll see you next week. Have a nice afternoon. Stay tuned for Patrick, but we'll leave you with the weather. Goodbye.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGibbon from the Met Office. It's another hot and humid day in the southeast, cloudier and cooler elsewhere, with some rain. Most of that rain falling close to a weather front which splits the country in two at the moment. It divides the hot and humid conditions that we're seeing across East Anglia and the southeast from the much fresher air that's arriving into the north and west of the UK. And for the Midlands into Wales and the southwest, some heavier and more persistent rain for a time during the evening, close to that weather front. Some lively showers developing perhaps in the North Midlands, pushing up into parts of Yorkshire overnight. And then by dawn, attention turns to the southeast, where some thundery rain turns up. And it's warm overnight here, 20, 21 Celsius in the far southeast, whilst a cooler feel for Scotland, Northern Ireland, western parts of England and Wales, with clearer spells expected. But the wet weather in the southeast continues during the morning. Could be some tricky conditions on the roads for a time before eventually it eases away. Some useful wet weather, of course. We do need the rain in the southeast. Further showers follow, but eventually brighter skies. And for many, it's a fine afternoon. Temperatures closer to average.